Today's webinar is to talk to you about change leadership in a changing world. What I propose to do is to describe the need for extraordinary change leadership in today's rapidly changing world. In the webinar presentation, I'm going to cover four things essentially. The first one is my collective or our collective view of change, where we will involve you and share some of your ideas. Secondly, to try and help you to understand what's happening in today's world and why existing approaches seem to have limited effectiveness. The third section will look at how to win in change in today's environment. And then finally, we'll talk about some guidelines for practical application, and there will be opportunities for you to join in and challenge yourselves, develop understanding throughout that. So let's move along. The first section we're looking at is a view of change. Many of you may feel that the pace of change is increasing. And I think the one that summed it up probably best for me was the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, in Davos last year, who said the pace of life has never been this fast, yet it will never be this slow again. So if change is unlikely to slow down, we'd better prepare ourselves for an interesting ride over the next few years. What I'd like to do at this early point of the webinar is to see if we've got some consensus on some of the strategic changes that you expect to see in the workplace and the FM sector over the next few years. So could you let us know briefly what you expect at a macro level and what's the impact that's likely to have? So you're going to share those ideas, I think, on chat. And whilst you're getting on with that in the background, some of the strategic themes that you might want to think about include things like the changing needs for physical workspace, more effective use of real estate. That could include reducing office footprint cost or perhaps even reducing retail space. You might be thinking about the impact of technology, whether that's disruptive technology, changing business models of today, whether it is technology that helps us, like automation of some functions, improved connectivity perhaps. You might be reflecting on how much facilities management is coming to the market over the next few years and what we expect. So do we have some themes coming through there, Fraser?
Yeah, we certainly do. I think, as you discussed, I think a couple of people have mentioned that obviously technology is going to have a dramatic impact. I think one area within that as well is the use of data. So obviously within FM and workplace, we are collecting a wide variety of data, both hard and soft sources. So, you know, it's how that data is used, but, you know, how it's also analysed and then how it's used to kind of drive change within workplace and FM. I think kind of linking to that, to technology and data, is also, you know, we maybe don't understand what the skills are required of the future workforce. So, you know, particularly when looking at things like big data, but, you know, also kind of what kind of analytics, people will need to be able to know and understand to be able to analyze that data. Another one coming through, and I think, again, you've mentioned it, the kind of sociological changes, so changes in working hours, patterns of working, things like that, you know, supporting flexible working as well. I think one aspect, and we kind of touched on it when we were talking before the presentation, is, you know, how much workplace is now going to impact things like, you know, talent acquisition and also talent retention. So providing, you know, working environments that, you know, people want to work within, and actually the workplace and the working environment is such a big part of you know, the brand of a company and how they kind of draw in talent. Somebody's also mentioned that you have.
This is really interesting. I'm dealing with a client at the moment where you see some of these factors almost in tension. So on one hand, absolutely 100% committed to a flexible workplace, sort of people that want to work for them absolutely demand that. But at the same time, they're trying to integrate graduate apprentices who have not been in the workplace before. And need to be in the workplace to some extent in order to complete their apprenticeship, train, develop, and acquire the skills. And how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think so somebody's kind of picked up on that. You have varying, particularly with, obviously millennials now coming into the workforce. You're going to have varying demographics and different expectations. So, how you're able to provide the kind of workspace and workplace for each of these groups and how you effectively engage them to communicate with each other. Somebody's also mentioned, particularly with remote workers and, obviously we know about the gig economy. You might have individuals who work for more than one organization, so working remotely and how you kind of manage those as well. So those individuals where their workspace might be, if it's an Uber driver, the car and the delivering parcels for somebody else next. So it is the changing world of the workforce.
Right, and so there's some common themes here, and the one that seems to underpin, well, maybe a couple that underpin a lot of these changes is we don't see the need for productivity going away. Productivity, however, is going to need to be enabled and supported in different ways, in different places, and in a more flexible manner. The other trend that I don't see going away as a strategy execution consultant is the organizational change. That at the same time as we've got these societal factors, we are also seeing no slackening off in terms of the number of deals that are being done in mergers, in acquisitions, in consolidations in various markets. In companies restructuring as they pivot their strategy from one thing to another over time. And all of that, of course, drives changes in demands on workplace and facilities management. So I think probably what we can conclude is we're expecting a lot of change. We can see some of the drivers for change, and perhaps some of them we can't yet see. We don't know, as I can see what one of you has pointed out, we don't know exactly what skills are going to be people are going to need to be equipped with in the future. And this is one of the challenges we've got that we're going to talk about in the webinar, that sort of lack of certainty that we have. Shall we move on? That was that was interesting, and thank you for sharing your views there. So we can see from that 30% of change programs do achieve their objectives, and 70% underachieve in some respects. So there's a huge yawning gap there in terms of a lost opportunity. But the majority of us are aware of that. On that particular piece of research, they concluded 8%, only 8% were good at both. They had much stronger percentages that were good at one or the other. But that's quite worrying, and there are multiple reasons why that could be the case. But what we're seeing here, I just selected 2 pieces of evidence. There's actually a lot more out there, and I think we're seeing a pattern. So just to give you a summary of some of the important evidence that I think we should take into account over a period of time. You can see the 2 questions I asked you there, but some pretty good validation there in terms of the lost opportunity in implementing strategy. The number of structural reorganizations that meet their stated objectives. And the one that intrigues me, and this was based on US research, but I challenge anybody to tell me it's very different over here, using the Gallup engagement survey that many of you will be familiar with too much value and opportunity being lost because change programs are either too rigid, too inflexible, or too ambitious to implement successfully. And we're seeing alongside that, and though not necessarily directly correlated, a staggering lack of engagement by employees, at least in the US. So overall conclusion is that we need to look at more carefully at the way we change. And I think we seem to be crossing into new ground here. The situation is that we've got unpredictable disruption to our lives. The rate of change is growing exponentially. The problems we face seem to be increasing in complexity in many areas. And the result of this is that the organizations that we're working in, and many of us grew up in, are stretched to the limits. They can't change effectively. Past ways of doing things, including traditional approaches to change management, can often make things worse rather than better. So, like dinosaurs, some of our programmed responses might not be so well suited to the future we face. So that's the problem statement. I think what we need to do now is to try and sort of dig into the problem, understand how we can relate to it. If we can frame the problem, we can understand what's happening and do something positive to change. So in this second section, I want to explore that. I'm going to introduce a simple model based, we call it 3 gaps model. The assumption here is that any business endeavor has got 3 basic steps. We seek outcomes in the form of business results. We make plans to achieve them. We take action as a result of those plans, and our actions result in outcomes. We tend then to observe those outcomes and make further plans. It's an ongoing cycle. So a lot of organizations, I think, see the problem as an execution problem. It's about turning plans into action. And there is a gap here. And we'll characterize that gap as an alignment gap. It's about getting people to do what the plan suggested, what we wanted them to do. And there are many reasons why that gap exists. For example, plans are not necessarily clear. They might not have been effectively communicated, or perhaps people chose not to follow them, perhaps because the situation that they were in didn't seem, the plan didn't seem as relevant as when it was created. But this alignment gap is only one of 3, and they need to be closed in a systematic approach because the gaps actually determine one another. They're co-determinate. The environment that we live in is somewhat chaotic. We can't predict the future with certainty, and we don't have all the information we need to do so. We rely on assumptions about the future. So making perfect plans is really, frankly, impossible. I don't think that's me. No, that's definitely not at my end. We can't make perfect plans. So the difference between what we know and what we would actually like to know, we refer to as a knowledge gap. Equally, we can't guarantee that actions taken as a result of our plans are going to achieve the desired outcomes. So there is an effects gap, and the effects gap describes the difference with the plans that we made and what actually happens when they make contact with the real world, complete with all of its uncertainties and unexpected events. I often quote a notable historic Prussian general, a chap called Helmut von Moltke, who once said, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy," and many of you may have heard that before. If you prefer your management philosophy from Mike Tyson, when a reporter asked him if he was worried about Evander Holyfield and his fight plan, Tyson replied, "Everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth." What he's saying is essentially the same thing. So we need to plan for reality. Unfortunately, many high achievement organizations know only one way to deal with these gaps, even if they don't really talk about them in those terms. Faced with a knowledge gap, a typical organizational response is to seek more detailed information, which of course costs time and resources. And no amount of information is going to guarantee the outcomes. The common result for an organization is they become immersed in data and assumptions to the extent that they no longer see the problem clearly. And detail and clarity are obviously not the same thing. Faced with an alignment gap, when strategies don't result in organisations behaving the way that they expected, typically we see a default to more detailed, granular plans. But what tends to happen is that leaders then lack confidence to act independently, and even in entrepreneurial organisations, it's very easy to become bureaucratic and process-led. Language starts to turn to accountability and staff alignment. And in the most extreme cases, staff are blamed for not being sufficiently engaged. Faced with an effects gap, when actions don't result in expected results, things tend to get worse. This happens because there are independent actors, including competitors, customers, factors that aren't in our control, bad luck, and even what we euphemistically refer to as acts of God. But the common organisational response is often seek more control, more reporting, more management reviews, and suffocating governance. In fact, any one of these responses, and you may recognise one or two, are bad enough. But when they're compounded, they have an insidious effect. They actually make the problem worse by turning organisations into large, expensive robots, consumed with being rather than doing. In a world full of exciting applications for technology, there's a place for robotics, but leading people through change isn't one of them. History has got many examples of companies who failed to adapt rapidly to rapidly changing circumstances, such as customer needs and habits. These include companies that you'll know well, like Kodak, Blockbuster, and British Home Stores. In a dynamic, uncertain, and complex environment, it's somewhat dangerous to do what you've done previously and expect the same result when the context has changed. Well summarised here by Peter Drucker, the father of modern management practice. So, I think we've dwelled enough time on the problem. Let's look at how we can win in this uncertain and dynamic world that we live in. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions and use a sort of slide model to explain this. The first one I'd like you to ask yourself is, how much consensus do you have in your organisation about the way ahead? And secondly, how much certainty do you have about the external environment that surrounds you looking forwards? In situations where you're close to agreement on the way ahead, and you're close to certainty about what the future holds, then traditional change management approaches are suitable and appropriate. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because in those circumstances, it's absolutely possible to plan your way to the future in detail and with confidence. But when the reverse is true, and you're far from agreement about the way ahead, and far from certainty about the external environment and how that's going to change, then an extraordinary approach to change is necessary. And what I'd like to do is really talk about that combination. And I'm going to introduce a subject called leading through intent, which we like to think of as extraordinary change leadership for uncertain times. Quick bit of theory. The idea here with leading through intent is based on that an organisation that thinks the problem is purely about execution is going to look for a solution based on increasing organisational alignment. I'm sure many of us will have participated in corporate programs designed to improve alignment. But the key, actually, if you want to respond holistically, is to think about increasing the amount of autonomy you can give people over how change is implemented at the same time as increasing alignment. And we talk about a concept called intent, which enables people to align, and as a consequence gives them more freedom to act independently as circumstances change, but always in line with intent. So that conceptually is what I'm going to describe. How does it work? Well, it's a joined up, coherent approach to closing these three gaps we spoke about earlier. And extraordinary change leadership needs to close all three. It requires different leadership disciplines acting as a whole. In the face of uncertainty, the key to the knowledge gap is to think through what information is available and gather only as much further information as absolutely necessary to define the intended outcome. An intended outcome or a statement of intent should include what needs to be achieved and why, or the purpose served by achieving it. Detail will often render this direction unclear because it tends to obscure the essential point rather than reinforce it. So when we're talking about a statement of intent, we're talking about no more than is essential to provide a rich picture of success and why it's important. And it's that statement of intent that provides a framework for decision making. The alignment gap can then be closed by allowing each level to define how they plan to achieve the intent. Of course, you need a simple process to ensure that people are briefed on what the intent is and provide any further guidance, such as constraints that need to be observed or how to make trade-offs. But they then should decide how they're going to achieve that intent. And we use the term backbrief to describe the process by which they confirm their understanding of the intent and that their actions are coherent and adequately resourced. Action planning, which is the process of seeking advice, deconflicting effort with others, and planning in detail how that change is to be achieved, should always be done by those who are to take the actions, not those who are directing them. And it's perfectly possible to align whole organizations by repeating this process in a cascade. It's not a coercive process, as people will readily align themselves given the chance and given clear intent. And then when it comes to execution, our effects gap is closed by having people using their own spontaneous and independent judgment to adjust their actions to achieve the intent. It's the intent that provides them the framework for doing so. If they're to actually demonstrate adaptive behaviour, they're also going to need support from leaders, both physical and moral. Giving them the confidence to act in this space is ultimately a test of leadership. So, I think in the final section, I want to try and pass on some simple pragmatic advice to help you to think and act differently about putting this model into practice. I'm a practitioner at heart rather than a theorist or an academic. So this advice is really based on my hard-won practical experience, including now some, oh, crikey, I'm thinking 18 years as a consultant doing precisely this in a variety of sectors and a variety of settings. So I've got, I think, three key pieces of advice around this model that I've explained to you. The first one is around closing the knowledge gap. And the most important thing that you can do is to be really clear, brutally clear on the what and the why. Everyone needs to understand the need for change and a clear end goal before they're going to engage in what's happening. They need to grasp both the emotional and the rational case for change. In practice, you cannot over-communicate intent. You need to communicate it, keep communicating it, and keep anchoring people's actions back to intent, so they will consistently use it as to provide their own boundaries and focus. Second point is around people and organizations needing a sense of urgency to change. It's fairly apparent, I think, if you think about something like climate change. Scientists were telling us about the predicament we faced 20 years ago, but few people really listened. It's only when we start to experience freak weather and we're clear how we're personally affected water lapping at our front door, if you like, that we start to change our behaviours. So change leaders really have got to create urgency to get any momentum at all. So when you're describing intent to your teams and to organisations, link change to the bigger picture, and don't be afraid to talk about the consequences of not changing. Resist the temptation to tell people too much. It's very tempting, I think, as a leader to be paternalistic and handhold people, particularly when you're concerned about them. But tough love is a practice that tends to breed leaders rather than followers. You need multiple methods and channels to communicate intent, and you certainly need to be prepared to listen to feedback and to adapt the message and iterate it based on that feedback. But do try and limit direction to these essential points about what must or must not happen and why it's important. We'll go on to talk about people finding their own path. The second gap that we described was an alignment gap. Extraordinary change leaders base their efforts on building a coalition of willing volunteers who will adopt change and filter it down to their departments and teams. You need to engage this coalition of volunteers in early decision making to encourage their buy-in and ensure that they're strong advocates for change. So leaders are going to, at all levels, going to need to invest time and effort to get this network working together across organisational boundaries and engage them to deliver change, set tasks and follow through to deliver deadlines. Leaders will need to follow up with regular coordination meetings, mentoring and support to ensure that this network of people are ready, willing and able to lead change. They will, of course, also need to do some traditional activity like maintaining effective and flexible communication with stakeholders to resolve conflicts and work on fixing obstacles to change. You will find obstacles as the irresistible force of a change network meets the immovable object of organisational hierarchy, but it's going to be a lot easier to resolve if you've all agreed the intent in advance. So your key role as leaders is to give people the opportunity to work out the how for themselves. People are more likely to own their part in the plan when they've got a chance to work it out for themselves, but you need to check they understand the overall intent, because it's that provides the context for their actions, clarity about the role they're expected to play, and therefore allows them to work out how they can support the change opportunity. I referred to this earlier on as this back brief process. And that's a great opportunity to start people thinking for themselves about how they will deliver it, and therefore as the situation changes, to plan how they're going to adapt. As leaders, you need to encourage people to challenge and question you too. One tip I always give here is to invite less experienced staff to contribute first. So it's really establishing a culture where everybody's views, including less experienced staff, are important, and providing them with a clear lead. The final point is about demonstrating the behaviours you wish to see. And this is a fairly traditional guideline. Change can be difficult. It still needs to be led from the top. And we talk about change leadership rather than change management. So it's important to ensure that you and your change team demonstrate beliefs and the behaviours supporting change. You need to ensure your attitudes reflect those you wish to see throughout the organisation. Some of the things you might need to think about here: challenging unfounded assumptions, remaining visible, but mindful of the fact that you're being watched as leaders. So you do need to be on guard, truthful and consistent in your communication, not afraid to say what you don't know, and making clear, no-nonsense decisions to help people adapt to new situations. Always remember that leadership are generally several steps ahead of the people they lead in terms of their readiness for change. So don't leave people behind. My final bit of guidance is around closing the effects gap. And the first point is around experimentation, essentially. When you don't have consensus about the way ahead, the best way forward is to encourage groups to experiment, to find a way to the future, identify and prove new concepts, generate quick wins, and provide some real-world evidence that helps us to find a way ahead. But in order to do that, they need to be protected. So as leaders, we need to find a way to provide them freedom to fail and celebrate their efforts to find a way forward, whether they succeed or not. We need to keep it real. Unrealistic targets often lead to compromised timelines and standards and an overall decline in morale. Planning and rehearsing for different scenarios, by contrast, leads to a higher chance of success, helping to keep workforces happy and positive. I'll share a story with you actually about a client who recently said to me that they believed in pessimism as a strategy. Now, I was pretty curious, as I'm sure you are at this point, what on earth did they mean? Their explanation of pessimism as a strategy meant simply that they started the planning change assuming that the situation would change. They were aware of the worst case, and they assumed that new challenges and new opportunities would emerge. Consequently, they planned realistic and pragmatic short-term objectives. They were clear about what they wanted in the long term and clear about what they didn't want to happen, and they provided their teams with flexibility to adapt and succeed. They have succeeded. They're an extremely challenging industry, managing the transition from print publishing to digital publishing. Fairly sort of disruptive impact of technology, if you like. The advice for everybody is to ensure that planning is thorough, takes different scenarios into account, but above all else, you're ready to adapt to a changing situation. And the decision to change needs to be as close to your front line as possible, where people have real-time information about the changing situation. The final piece of advice here really is about maintaining urgency and not giving up. When we're doing change, executing change, it's very tempting to see a quick win and celebrate success too early. Change is pretty fragile until new ways of working become the norm. And at this critical point, a lot of organizations tend to lose their focus and get blown off course. A change journey in the future may take many different paths, and at an organizational level, what we need to do is to make sure that change momentum is maintained, that change gets embedded, and people are not able to slide back to familiar ways of working. So one of the most important things we can do is to ensure that change is fully integrated. And by that, I mean that it's reflected in organizational processes, systems, and behaviors, so that the change gets fully embedded into our culture and can't be blown off course. So those summarize my advice around how we should act around those three gaps. In the final section of this webinar, I've got a challenge for you. You're probably expecting change in the organizations you're in, and this is a good opportunity to reflect on some of the things that we've discussed and I've described in this webinar. To think about how you're leading change in your organization, and to identify any opportunities that exist to improve change leadership. So what I'd like you to do for a few minutes is to make some commitments to yourself, to change something, to improve your ability and repertoire as change leaders. What can you think or do differently to be more effective? How will you apply it at work? So why don't you make up 3 commitments to yourself? Record them, write them down,
Mark, thanks again for your time today and fascinating presentation. If we have no further questions, nothing coming through, then we'll end on this note then, Charles Darwin.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed, Fraser, Nicole and IWFM for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be involved in this webinar this morning, and yeah, I look forward to hearing some feedback after the event.
Excellent, that's great. Thanks, everybody.